Okay, so Facebook decided to axe the accounts of Alex Jones, Paul Joseph Watson, Milo, Laura Loomer, lots of other people. And there has been a collective freakout on the right, well, at least amongst a large portion of the right, who basically see this as a sign of the end times for the right on the internet, and that essentially we're going to go on for the rest of human history with the right wing completely being shut off of the internet and only existing, I guess, in-person dialogue. The fear is that the left is monopolizing the internet, and therefore they will control the conversation and public discourse without any pushback. And therefore, if there's no one to challenge their ideas, then they'll simply waltz into re-election every 2 to 4 years with absolutely no problems. However, I think people are reading way too much into this, and they consider the present state of the internet, I guess you could say the infrastructure of social media, they view that as way too stable. The people who are most upset about this issue seem to be people who think that sites like Facebook and Twitter will exist in perpetuity and that nothing will ever replace them. Furthermore, they think that the role of sites like Facebook and Twitter will remain constant and will never change. They view Facebook and Twitter not as rather specialized websites, but as general utilities like a telephone. I think Will Chamberlain articulates this point probably the best, though I still think it's a quite weak one, because the difference between something like a telegraph or a telephone and a site like Facebook or Twitter is that the telephone company merely sold you a service of communication. It was very simple. It was peer-to-peer, everyone had a number, and you only talked to people you wanted to talk to. Whereas with social media sites like Facebook and Twitter, they're selling an experience. The Facebook and Twitter are feeding their users posts and things. They're promoting certain posts. Their users essentially swim in a sea of communication. Most people don't really use the direct lines to each other like, say, Facebook Messenger or direct messages on Twitter. And so because of this, what people do and do not want to see on these sites becomes very important to their level of satisfaction with the websites. Now, the problem that Twitter and Facebook currently have is that they market themselves to be all things to all people. However, inevitably, you're going to have people who, because it is the internet, people are going to end up using sites like Facebook and Twitter and end up getting offended. They're going to see posts they don't like, and they're going to take that out back on the company. And that's what we've seen with folks like Brian Stelter and Oliver Darcy of CNN, constantly calling on social media sites to ban people like Alex Jones, who they don't like. They want to see these people banned from these sites because it takes away from their personal experience using the site. Now, obviously, there are just as many people on the other side of that issue who very much enjoy seeing posts by people like Alex Jones and Paul Joseph Watson and Milo Yiannopoulos. There was a time when, back in the day, when I followed Alex Jones, Paul Joseph Watson, and Milo all on Twitter. However, 2 of those people have been banned. The only one left is old Prison Planet. And that, of course, losing people like Milo and Alex Jones on Twitter has been detrimental to my experience. So you can see here, not just in the case of left and right, but most notably in the case of people on the left and the right, their enjoyment of these platforms is somewhat mutually exclusive. If the right is happy, the left is going to be unhappy, but if the left is happy, then the right is going to be unhappy. Ultimately, the left does not want to see posts by conservatives. It's just not something that they're interested in. People on the right tend to be much more open to seeing folks on the left. They kind of like to tease them and troll them. But people on the left really want to swim in their own sea. So that means that inevitably, if everyone is going to exist on the internet, you're going to have sites that cater to one of those two sides. And so right now, sites like Twitter and Facebook are having to choose which of those two audiences they want to prioritize and keep on their site. Because we know that there is a massive demand for social media. That's why you have so many millions and millions of people on these sites like Twitter and Facebook. And up until now, Twitter and Facebook have really wanted to keep everyone to themselves so that they could have the whole of the market share, or at least as big of a market share as possible. They didn't want to fragment their user base along the lines of what I'm talking about. But as I've said, I think that that's entirely inevitable. Michael Malice was the first person who I heard bring up this point, and I have to say that it grows on me more and more every day. that what we're seeing on these sites, like if you take Facebook's most recent actions of banning Paul Joseph Watson, Alex Jones, Milo, Laura Loomer, we're not really seeing the censorship of conservatives. What we're seeing is the fragmentation of social media. It's a much bigger story, because obviously these people can all still exist on sites like Gab and Minds. And so all we're seeing is that Facebook and Twitter look like they're going to end up deciding to cater more to a left-wing audience than to a right-wing audience, which is absolutely fine, because they are a company and they are trying to serve a particular market. Calling Facebook the public square, I think, is completely ridiculous and short-sighted. By that standard, a few years ago, MySpace or Friendster would have been the public square. And frankly, Facebook is mostly used by boomers at this point, I think. I mean, I've never even had a Facebook account. Most people I know who still use Facebook are pretty much over 50. And interestingly enough, it is the baby boomers who are the number one group when it comes to spreading fake news. And I mean legitimate fake news, not just, opinion pieces that certain people on CNN might disagree with. And Facebook, as you may have heard, as a part of this whole roundup of people like Alex Jones and Milo Yiannopoulos, are trying to crack down on fake news on the site, and they're trying to stop people from spreading it. Well, if they do that, who they're really cracking down on is their primary demographic, the baby boomers. The boomers on Facebook, it's kind of the number one reason why I don't even use Facebook, is because the boomers spread these trash memes, which are full of often erroneous facts, and they post links to sites like True Pundit and Gateway Pundit. So if Facebook's trying to crack down on fake news, they're going to lose a lot of their user base. They're simply going to have to start banning and censoring a good chunk of the people who use the site, because, of course, baby boomers and older people tend to lean to the right anyway. So, I mean, Facebook is really going to have a pretty small market share if they decide that we want to be a site for older, like 45 to 70-year-old left-wingers. But, I mean, there is still a market for that. And, of course, in all this, we can't forget that the users on a social media site are the product, not the customer. The customer are the advertisers. The users are the product. So by calling people like Alex Jones and Paul Joseph Watson, all Facebook is doing is reorganizing their product lineup, which, like I said, is inevitable. That's why there are certain ads you don't see paired up with certain kinds of programming on television. You don't see KY commercials next to SpongeBob. But still, I almost forgot, there's also the point that as a solution that folks like Will Chamberlain, who I do like, often bring up, and that is, of course, we should regulate these people like public utilities. Facebook should be for everyone to use. No one should be able to be banned from Facebook. And all I have to say on that is I think that there's a lot of good scholarship that refutes the idea that somehow individual people on the internet would at all be benefited from more state involvement in how people run their websites. There's an excellent book by a scholar by the name of Gabriel Kolko called Railroads and Regulation. And railroads were pretty much the first industry to be regulated in the sense that we understand in the United States. And while publicly this regulation was touted as a way of somehow protecting consumers and the little guy from, the big mean railroad companies, it turns out that this regulatory regime was constructed and run by the railroad owners themselves. In fact, the railroad owners came up with this regulation scheme as a way of cartelizing their industry and shutting out smaller competition. By regulating their industry, they essentially locked themselves in for the long haul, as if there was a very narrow range of competition within the industry, there was really no reason for new firms to enter into the market. Once they set the rules for how the railroad businesses were to be operated, there was no way that anybody could challenge them. There was no alternative business model. The main thing that the railroads did in getting these regulations passed by Congress was that they forced all of the railroad companies to publish their prices. And what this did was it eliminated the potential that shippers could negotiate with the railroads to try and get better rates for, say, shipping in bulk or something like that, or shipping at different times, or essentially they couldn't bid out their shipments. Everyone charged the same price for the same freight, so there was no reason to compete with a railroad, and therefore, if you were already running one route, there was no reason for another railroad to try and lay tracks and compete with you on that route. There's no point in investing, laying another set of railroad tracks from Atlanta to Kansas City if you're only going to be able to charge the same price as the guy who's already in operation. You're not going to be able to compete. And this is essentially what has happened with every industry that's been regulated in the United States. And I don't know the histories of other countries as well, but considering that we're going back to the 1870s here, this is, I would have to say that regulation as a concept is and has always been a con. It's a way of empowering the corporations who are going to have the most sway over these regulatory agencies. You're never going to have the little guy in there. You're never going to have individual users somehow, in like a weird socialist utopian sense, running the means of social media production. If you leave things to freedom of association and you allow everyone, whoever wants to make their own website to try and compete with Facebook, well, then at least you have a chance. You might lose, but you have a chance. If you give things up to the state, you always lose. The government is never your friend. You have to understand that. You have no influence over your government. Your individual vote means nothing. And even if you voted for someone, let's say, who ran on after the social media companies are nationalized and inevitably captured by the corporations who then run the regulatory agency and use the regulatory agency to affirmatively censor conservatives, let's say you all get together and you elect some members of Congress who promise to change that. What you'll find is not only will your congressman be bought off his first day in Washington, but also Congress really has no power against the executive branch anymore. There is a slim chance that once these regulations get put in place, that Congress will ever be able to band together to actually change them. I mean, the odds are, even if you elect a strong contingency of, let's say, Republican congressmen who somewhat care about this issue, there will never be enough of them to actually get something through Congress. And again, even if you get it through Congress, if you have an opposing party president who put in a director of the social media administration who is hostile to conservatives, and then you pass an act rebuking him, the president is just going to veto that. There's absolutely no way that anyone on the right wins by throwing this to the government. That is the most short-sighted nonsense I've ever heard. But, I think conservatives are really champions at losing. That's why they're really just progressives driving the speed limit, because they always give up ground. It's just a matter of when. And that's why I don't call myself a conservative. I don't like losing personally. I don't want to give up ground. I don't want to be, I don't want to go back to the 1990s Democratic Party. That's not my platform. I'm not a fan of Bill Clinton, and I wasn't a fan of Obama, and I'm not going to be a fan of the next guy, and I'm not the biggest fan of Trump. So, in short, if the conservatives around the world are pushed out by the social media oligopolies, they will push them into new sites. There's absolutely nothing to fear from this. And frankly, people will probably be a lot happier once we achieve self-segregation amongst people's political views. Now, I think it'll be a little boring to not have, say, lefties on social media sites, with people on the right, but there's really no way for the status quo to continue, and it's inevitable. And frankly, we should welcome it, because what this means is that you're going to have the individual social media sites be much less powerful, because they're not going to be able to appeal to the entirety of the market. And I don't think that social media is just going to split along political lines. It's going to split along all sorts of lines of interest. I think that's why Reddit is popular as it is. Reddit is a site where people can become extremely specialized and have their little subs that deal with rather arcane topics. And stuff like that is probably the future. So if you got anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and subscribing. And if you do subscribe, please do click the bell, because I do upload every day, and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.